In ancient Greece, pederasty was the practice of older men serving as mentors to young boys in exchange for sexual favors. This practice was widespread, though customs and attitudes differed drastically from Greek city-state to city-state. In Sparta, it was part of the culture. In Athens, laws were made to curb pederasty and homosexuality in general. For a good example, look no further than ancient Greece. The way that Plato, Aristotle, and their contemporaries conceived of human sexuality was fundamentally different from the way we do today. Hellenistic scholars doubt the Greeks would have been able to understand the modern distinction between homosexual and heterosexual relationships. In classical antiquity, people didn't care if you were attracted to men or women. What mattered was whether you were the dominant, active, or submissive, passive partner in the bedroom. Not only did the Greeks have a different way of thinking about sexuality, but they also condoned a type of semi-romantic, semi-sexual relationship that would never be permitted in Western countries today: pederasty. Pederasty in Sparta. Most of what we know about pederasty in Sparta comes from classical texts written by outside observers. One of the characters in Plato's Laws stresses that homosexuality in the warrior civilization was not just socially acceptable, but universally practiced. According to Plutarch, who was born long after Greece had been incorporated into Rome, pederasty was deeply embedded in the Spartan ritual system, specifically in the agoge, the arduous training program that turned boys into soldiers. Describing life in the agoge, Plutarch writes that shortly after the boys turned 12 years old, they were favored with the society of lovers from among the reputable young men. He continues, the boys' lovers also shared with them in their honor or disgrace, and it is said that one of them was once fined by the magistrates because his favorite boy had let an ungenerous cry escape him while he was fighting. Moreover, though this sort of love was so approved among them that even the maidens found lovers in good and noble women, still, there was no jealous rivalry in it, but those who fixed their attentions on the same boys made this rather a foundation for friendship with one another, and persevered in common efforts to make their loved one as noble as possible. It has been argued that pederasty originated from coming-of-age rituals that could date back as far as the Stone Age. In Sparta, the practice had adapted to the city-state's unique culture, which emphasized community over family. Children were raised by the agoge, not their parents. The older lovers, called erastes in academic literature, had as much authority over their beloveds as their biological fathers did. The idea, as Plutarch puts it, was that they were all in a sense the fathers and tutors and governors of all the boys. Athenian laws. In ancient Athens, things were a little more complicated. There was, however, a law that prohibited you from committing what was known as hubris, the act of humiliating or dishonoring another person for one's own gratification. A quintessentially Greek concept, hubris not only encompassed prostitution and sexual assault, but also consensual relationships. According to Cohen, men who consented to being the submissive partner were often described as committing hubris against themselves. Crucially, the same standards did not apply to slaves, who being slaves were perceived as lacking both pride and honor. Current scholarship on pederasty, Cohen repeats, asserts that there was no law prohibiting an Athenian male from consummating a sexual relationship with a free boy without using force or payment. That said, scholars have found many statutes that seem to address pederasty indirectly. The law against hubris is one example. Another is a law that prevented boys as well their teachers from entering a schoolhouse before dawn or after dusk. Homosexuality and nature. Why did Athens seek to limit pederasty when so many other city-states, including Sparta, openly permitted it? This question does not have a clear answer. Evidence suggests that Athenians did not have any issues with age differences. As time went on, young girls were married to older men all the time, but rather with homosexuality itself. Aristotle would reach the same conclusion, professing that, because males inseminate females, they must necessarily assume a dominant, active, heterosexual role. If they don't, adds Xenophon, they would be taking the place of women. It is notable that Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon were unable to separate the idea of sex from biological reproduction, rejecting or failing to consider the modern notion that it is perfectly okay for people to have intercourse for the sake of pleasure, or that they should pick partners and sexual roles that they feel affirm their personal identities. Depictions of men, women, and creatures, such as satyrs masturbating, can be found in countless Greek artworks, and the act is mentioned in many works of ancient Greek comedy. The act was also linked to lower classes and slaves in both art and drama, signaling that while accepted, it was not considered sophisticated. While considered a normal and natural act, pleasuring oneself was also believed to be a private activity, and doing so in public was a great scandal. This is why the famous cynical philosopher, Diogenes, caused such a stir when he famously masturbated in public. Couples rarely married for love, and while they did have sex to produce children, married couples in ancient Greece most often slept separately, and men carried on extramarital relationships. Women, on the other hand, could be punished severely for infidelity. In ancient Greece, courtesans or hetairai were not simply escorts. They were seen as educated, interesting, and intelligent, so that they could have engaging discussions with their clients. A number of particularly alluring and intelligent hetairai became famous and garnered significant influence in ancient Greece, most notably Phryne. Unlike most Athenian women, who rarely left their homes and had very little voice in society, courtesans like Phryne were granted much more freedom. From the Deep Sophists by Athenaeus, we also know that Phryne was the wealthiest self-made woman in all Athens at the time. Unlike in many countries today, prostitution was completely legal and even supported by the state in many city-states in ancient Greece. There were many state-run brothels in ancient Athens that were also taxed after the lawmaker Solon legalized prostitution. Services also had a set price across Athens and were regulated. Prostitution was widespread across ancient Greece, but particularly in Athens, where men were married after the age of 30. Women, on the other hand, were often married around the age of 16. Strict laws regarding sex with free women outside of marriage, which could be punished by death, meant that young Athenian men's choices for having sex were limited mainly to prostitutes. Even after marriage, men visited both male and female prostitutes often. Marriage in Greek antiquity was often considered to be a financial, social, political, and familial decision. Sexuality as we know it didn't exist in ancient Greece. In fact, pederasty, meaning the act of older men engaging in sexual activity with younger men, was very common in ancient Greece. The older man, usually in his 30s, was thought to take a younger boy, usually in his teens, under his wing, and provide him with companionship and education. This included sexual activity, but, as being a passive partner in sexual activity was looked down on in ancient Greece, this did not include penetration. Another important aspect of sexuality in ancient Greece was prostitution. In Greece, there were two versions of prostitutes, namely hetairai, or high-class escorts and courtesans, and pornai, or lower-class prostitutes and slaves who most often worked in brothels and on street corners. Both men and women worked as prostitutes in ancient Greece. The historical narrative of ancient Greece is often dominated by the exploits of male figures, philosophers, warriors, and politicians. However, a closer look at the available evidence reveals a complex and varied picture of the lives of women. Their roles were not monolithic. They differed significantly based on social class, city, state, and the specific time period. While women were largely excluded from the public sphere, their influence and importance within the private domain, particularly the household, were foundational to Greek society. The public and private spheres. Ancient Greek society was sharply divided into two spheres: the oikos, the household, and the polis, the city-state. For most women, their lives were centered almost entirely around the oikos. This private sphere was considered their domain, where their primary duties were managing the household, raising children, and overseeing domestic tasks. The public sphere of the polis, which included politics, law, and warfare, was almost exclusively the domain of men. This segregation was not merely a social convention, it was deeply ingrained in the legal and philosophical frameworks of the time. Thinkers like Aristotle believed that women were naturally inferior to men, both physically and intellectually, and were therefore unsuited for the rigors of public life. This viewpoint justified their exclusion from civic participation and reinforced their subordinate status. Women in Athens, a glimpse into a patriarchal society. The most well-documented example of women's lives in ancient Greece comes from Athens, a city-state known for its democratic ideals for men, at least. Athenian women were citizens, but this title did not grant them the same rights as men. They could not vote, hold public office, or own property in their own names. Their legal status was that of a minor, and they were always under the guardianship of a male relative, first their father, then their husband, and if widowed, their son or another male family member. The primary goal of an Athenian woman's life was to be a wife and mother. Marriages were typically arranged, often to men significantly older than them, with the goal of securing alliances between families and producing legitimate male heirs. The dowry a woman brought to the marriage was a crucial part of this arrangement, representing her share of her family's wealth. While the husband managed the dowry, it was legally tied to the wife and was meant to provide for her security in case of a divorce or his death. Within the home, a well-born Athenian woman was expected to be a skilled household manager. She was responsible for supervising slaves, managing the family's finances, and ensuring the smooth running of daily life. Weaving and textile production were particularly important tasks, as they were not only necessary for clothing the family but also a sign of a well-run household. This labor was often performed by both the woman and her female slaves. The social lives of Athenian women were also highly restricted. They were largely confined to the home, and when they did venture out, they were often accompanied by a female slave. Public appearances were limited to specific religious festivals and funerals. The ideal of the virtuous Athenian woman was one who was rarely seen and even more rarely spoken about in public. Sparta, an exception to the rule. The lives of women in Sparta stand in stark contrast to their Athenian counterparts. Spartan society was organized around military readiness, and this focus on physical prowess extended to women as well. Unlike in Athens, Spartan girls received formal education, including athletic training. They participated in running, wrestling, and discus throwing alongside their male peers. The Spartans believed that strong, healthy women would produce strong, healthy babies, who would in turn become formidable soldiers. Spartan women also enjoyed a level of freedom and autonomy unknown elsewhere in Greece. They were not confined to the home and could own and manage property. Because Spartan men were often away at war, women were entrusted with running the family estates and finances. As a result, Spartan women accumulated significant wealth and land, with some historians estimating that they owned up to a third of all Spartan land. While they still could not hold political office, their influence was considerable. Their role as the mothers of warriors gave them a respected, almost revered status. They were known for their fierce independence and wit, as evidenced by a famous anecdote where a foreign woman remarks to a Spartan woman, "You Spartan women are the only ones who can rule men." The Spartan woman's reply was, "Yes, because we are the only ones who give birth to men." The lives of working women and foreigners. The experiences of women were not limited to the elite citizen class. The lives of non-citizen women and enslaved women were vastly different. Foreign women, or metex, and working-class citizen women had more freedom of movement than their upper-class counterparts because they had to work. They could be found in the marketplace, running small shops, or working as wet nurses, laundresses, or artisans. Enslaved women had the hardest lives of all. They were considered property and had no rights. Their duties ranged from domestic servitude to working in fields or mines, and they were vulnerable to sexual exploitation by their masters. Their labor was essential to the functioning of Greek society, yet they are the most invisible group in the historical record. Religious and cultural roles. Despite their exclusion from political life, women played a vital and visible role in ancient Greek religion. They were central to religious rituals and festivals, and many priestesses held positions of great authority. The Oracle of Delphi, one of the most important religious figures in the ancient world, was a woman. Women participated in numerous festivals, such as the Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, which was exclusively for married women. These festivals provided a rare opportunity for women to gather, socialize, and engage in public life outside the confines of their homes. The legal status of women in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, was a testament to their subordinate social standing. Women were not considered full citizens and were legally represented by a male guardian known as a kyrios. This could be their father, husband, or a male relative. The kyrios was responsible for all legal matters on her behalf, including representing her in court and managing her financial affairs. Women could not directly own or dispose of large amounts of property. While a woman could own personal items and a small dowry, the significant family wealth was controlled by men. The dowry was a critical component of marriage, as it served as a form of security for the woman and a contribution to the new household. However, it was technically owned and managed by the husband, and if he died, it would be passed to his male heirs. In cases of divorce, the dowry would typically be returned to the woman's family. This legal framework ensured that property and political power remained within the hands of men. Inheritance laws were also designed to favor male heirs, with property passing from father to son. Only in the absence of male heirs could a daughter inherit, and even then, she would be required to marry her closest male relative to keep the property within the family line. This practice, known as epikleros, ensured that family wealth was not lost to another lineage. Women's influence on culture and arts. Despite their limited public roles, women's influence was felt in various cultural and artistic domains. While they were not the primary creators of public art or literature, their roles as muses, patrons, and subjects of art were significant. In pottery and sculpture, women were often depicted in domestic settings, performing tasks like weaving, fetching water, or participating in religious ceremonies. These depictions offer valuable insights into their daily lives and the societal ideals of femininity. Famous sculptures like the Venus de Milo and the Caryatids of the Erechtheion celebrate the female form and its symbolic power. In literature, women were often central figures in Greek tragedy and poetry. Characters like Antigone, Medea, and Clytemnestra are powerful and complex figures who challenge the social order and explore themes of justice, fate, and revenge. The poet Sappho of Lesbos stands out as a rare example of a female voice from the ancient world. Her lyrical poetry, which often explored themes of love, desire, and female relationships, made her one of the most celebrated poets of her time, though only fragments of her work survive. Not all women's lives were confined to the home. Heteras were a distinct class of women who existed on the fringes of society. Unlike citizen women who were expected to be demure and chaste, heteras were often highly educated, independent, and socially sophisticated. They attended symposia, male drinking parties, engaged in intellectual discussions, and provided companionship and entertainment. Heteras were not merely prostitutes. They were often sought after for their conversational skills and cultural knowledge. They were some of the only women who had the freedom to move in public spaces and interact with prominent men on an intellectual level. While their social status was ambiguous, they played a significant role in the cultural life of the city-states, particularly Athens. Conclusion: a diverse and evolving picture. The lives of women in ancient Greece were far from uniform. They varied dramatically based on geography, social class, and the specific laws of their city-state. While the patriarchal norms of Athenian society placed strict limitations on women's lives, the athletic and property-owning women of Sparta represent a significant departure from this norm. The contributions of working women, foreigners, and heteras further complicate the narrative, revealing a society where women's roles were both constrained and, in some cases, surprisingly influential. The historical record, though incomplete, paints a picture of women who, despite facing immense social and legal barriers, were central to the functioning of Greek society and left their mark on its culture and history in myriad ways.